years ago, I was asked a really simple question, and one that had a very big impact on me. The question was, can I stay here? And it was being asked by my mother-in-law, Pauline. Here she is. Pauline was 82 years old, a much-loved mother to 4 sons and grandmother to 11. Her husband had died a few years earlier, and she was living on her own in a village in the New Forest, busy with the WI, tending her garden and looking after friends and family. A few months earlier, she'd noticed a drop in her weight and stamina. Medical tests showed that she had cancer, which had already spread to her liver. She started treatment, but after 3 cycles of chemotherapy, the side effects were making her life a misery, so she stopped. And she rallied again for a while. But then she became weaker until she got to the point when she was struggling to look after herself. And she made the decision to move to be nearer to her family. So she came to stay with us, thinking she might find a care home nearby to be in. She never wanted to be a burden. None of us had been brave enough to ask Pauline what she wanted. None of us had broached the D word, death. We were all too busy tiptoeing around it and just reacting to changes in circumstances rather than looking ahead and making plans together. And that included me. I'm a GP with many years of experience, but with my own dear mother-in-law, I hadn't had the courage to ask her, what do you want? What are your fears or worries? Where would you like to be towards the end of your life? Question, can I stay here? Answer, yes, of course. Not a long, complicated conversation, but it was one that told us all that we needed to know. It was crystal clear what we needed to do. So Pauline came to stay with us, and we looked after her until she died peacefully in the night 3 weeks later. We had wonderful support from friends and family, from carers and nurses, and from the palliative care team. People came and went often, and we had great gatherings around the kitchen table, sharing memories, love, and support. But it was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. In fact, looking after Pauline was the hardest thing that I have ever done. But it was also the biggest privilege I've ever had. After this experience, it struck me, getting care right at the end of life is so important. We only have one chance. And so often, we don't like to talk about it. We don't want to cause upset or pain. We're very British. But at work, I've seen it many times when a frail person becomes acutely unwell and the ambulance is called and they're rushed to hospital for treatment. And often, this is successful. But there are many times when it hasn't been, and treatment is escalated even though it's futile. We find it very hard to acknowledge that death is inevitable eventually. And many of us feel uncomfortable talking about it, including some healthcare professionals. Sitting down and talking with some of my older patients, I've discovered that although some would like to go to hospital if it might help them if they're ill, many others are completely clear that they never want to go to hospital again if there's a viable alternative, even if they may die sooner. Hospital can be a really scary place. These people would prefer to be cared for and to die at home in familiar surroundings with family and friends nearby, retaining their dignity. So, while times are calm, we can sit and talk and make plans about what to do in the event of a crisis to avoid having to make decisions in the heat of the moment. And we call this advanced care planning. Now, time for a little bit of background. 100 years ago in the UK, death was more commonplace. It was part of life, not really hidden away. And death often came quite suddenly with accidents or infections or in childbirth. But nowadays, people are living a lot longer, and we see a different pattern. On this graph, the vertical axis represents our general level of health, how well we are. And the horizontal axis represents time over months and years. And we can broadly divide the decline towards death into 4 different categories. The first one, sudden death, a catastrophic event like a heart attack or an accident, completely unforeseen, and somebody dies. This happens in about 10% of deaths. The second group we see in terminal illnesses like some cancers, when the person's general level of health can sometimes be maintained at a high level for some time after diagnosis, until their condition deteriorates over weeks or months quite rapidly and they die, like Pauline. And this is seen in about a quarter of deaths. The third group, accounting for a third of deaths, we see a variable decline over months or years, and this is in chronic organ failure like kidney failure, heart failure, or chronic lung disease, when there are episodes of illness from which the person usually recovers but never getting back to their previous level of health. And they will eventually die during one of these dips, but it can be very difficult to predict which one, so death can still come as a bit of a shock. The fourth and largest group is characterized by a faltering decline over several years, and we see this in the physical frailty of old age and in dementia, when the body's ability to respond to the inevitable health challenges just diminishes. And this is the largest group, 35% of deaths. So we can see that for most of us, there will be plenty of time to look ahead and make plans before it's too late. But we can never assume that we will know when death is near, because there isn't always an obvious terminal illness period. Nowadays, death is often hidden away in nursing homes and hospitals. It's less familiar to us, and we find it harder to talk about. We've lost our vocabulary to do with death, and people often refer to it obliquely. I've lost my dad, or she passed away, or he gave up the ghost. We find it awkward and embarrassing talking about dying and death, and we pretend that it's not going to happen, that we're immortal. And sometimes we just fail to speak the truth to our loved ones, which isn't always very helpful. The reality is that not many of us have spoken about what we might want at the end of our lives. Why? Well, I think for many of us, death just feels too far off right now. Oh, I'm too young to worry about that. I'll know when the time is right. Or others are just a bit superstitious. If I write my will, then I will die. But not only are we all going to die, yes, I can guarantee it, but many of us will experience the death of somebody close to us. And there is no magic formula to knowing when it's the right time to talk about dying and death. The most important thing is to have that conversation before it's too late. How many of us might have thought, oh, I really should talk to so-and-so about all this, but I don't want to upset them. You might be relieved if they were to reply, oh, I'm so pleased you brought the subject up. I've been wanting to talk to you about this for a long time, but, I didn't know how to start. I didn't want to upset you. And how many of us might have brushed aside somebody's attempt to raise issues like this, maybe saying they want to be buried rather than cremated, with a, oh, don't be so morbid. You've got years left. Have you told anybody what you think you'll want at the end of your life? Has anybody tried to tell you what they'll want? Well, there's a lot to talk about, and not all of this will resonate with you right now or be a priority for you, but it might be important for somebody close to you. So, Have you considered writing a will or sorting out finances? If you have dependents, children, or a cat, who might look after them if you die? And have you considered appointing somebody to speak on your behalf if you ever get to the point where you can't make decisions or communicate those decisions? For example, if you have a stroke or get dementia. Do you want to take steps now to refuse certain medical treatments in the future, like artificial ventilation or tube feeding or resuscitation if your heart stops beating? Do you want to donate organs after your death? And if you do end up needing to be looked after at the end of your life, how might that look for you? And do you have strong feelings about where you would like to be when you die? You may even want to share ideas about your funeral. It's a lot, isn't it? And depending on what matters to you, you'll need to find the right people to talk to, whether that's a trusted friend or your family, a solicitor or your doctor. But I want you to know that telling others what you want at the end of your life can be one of the most loving things you can do for those close to you, because it can bring clarity. It can avoid confusion and family conflict. It can help to prevent unwanted medical intervention. And it can help you to stay more in control towards the end of your life and maybe feel a little calmer at that time. So, talk, share your plans, write them down, and tell someone where to find them. Or take even more practical steps. Let me introduce Judy. Judy is an old friend of mine. And over the past 20 years, she's had some very close shaves. She's been seriously unwell. But I'm glad to say that now she's a lot more stable. And she lives alone with a bit of support from friends and family. She really enjoys going out, joining in with things. In fact, she loves a good game of mahjong. Now, some time ago, Judy thought, if my heart were to stop beating, I wouldn't want people jumping on my chest to restart it and giving me electric shocks. I'd want to be allowed to die naturally. So she went to see her doctor and she asked for a do not resuscitate form to keep at home. But ever practical, Judy thought, what happens if I'm out and I collapse because my heart stopped and the paramedics come, but there's no form to be seen? So she took a bus to High Wycombe and she visited the tattoo parlour. It's right at the bottom. I don't know if you can see. DNR, do not resuscitate. Let's take inspiration from Judy. Let's talk, make plans and share them. And then get on with living life to the full, right to the end. Who do you need to talk to? Thank you.